Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of Rehash. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and I have a special co-host with me today, Anay Sim, who also hosts Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. And in this episode, we are going to be talking all about DAO governance, collaboration tools, different types of power structure in DAOs, Orca pods, and a lot more with Julia Rosenberg, co-founder of Orca Protocol. Welcome, Julia. So happy to have you here today.
Thank you guys. I'm so excited. This is my favorite duo to talk with.
Oh my gosh. Before we dive into all things DAOs and Orca, can you just give listeners a little background on who you are, what were you doing before Web3, and how did you initially fall down the Web3 rabbit hole?
Yes, absolutely. So I am a co-founder, and my new title that was given to me by product manager on my team, Dan Wu, is Chief Pod Officer at Orca Protocol. Just as background, I previously operated in sort of the consumer social startup space, which is also how I fell down the Web3 rabbit hole. My sort of journey in coming to Web3 was very much rooted in my frustrations in sort of classic Web2 consumer social. I got very frustrated as I was building and iterating that Web2 basically only optimizes for a single growth strategy, which is just a game of the masses, like more people, more subscribers, more followers, more users, just more people, without actually introducing the right rails for value accrual or sustainable growth over time. And what I became really frustrated in is that as these ecosystems grew, whether it was like a digital community or a corporate structure, any of these kind of like group identities, is that as they got bigger, they actually became less effective, less intimate, less connected over time, which was very sad to see because what originally drew people to that original like group structure very much degraded over time. And so that was like the core frustration I had coming from the Web2 world. And obviously what pulled me down the Web3 is how do we actually introduce different value mechanisms alongside our growth paths and our growth strategies, both with digital communities, organizations, all of these things. And obviously that started my very early love of pods and the early concept of pods, which is what we're working on at Orca, and just thinking very critically of how humans operate best, really regardless of the context, is people operate best in small working groups, which is not something we see a lot in the Web2 world because of this sort of growth strategy that it's very attached to.
I love that. Something similar to you, one of the ways that I fell down the crypto rabbit hole was thinking about DAOs as a different type of coordination mechanism. And I know your work at Orca is directly related to that. But to level set here, so we're going to be talking a lot about DAOs in this conversation and what you guys are doing at Orca with your different structuring mechanisms. And you are one of the DAO queens within this space, Julia. So, at a basic level, I'd love for you to describe what a DAO is to someone, because it still feels like there's a lot of confusion around that in this space.
Yes, it's sort of funny. And I actually roasted one of Rabbit Hole's members, Zach, on this the other day. He was part of a Twitter Spaces, and the ending question was, what's a DAO? Everyone just describe what a DAO is. And everyone freezed up. Like, these are all DAO experts, people that live, breathe, like operate DAOs. And everyone froze up when they actually had to define a DAO, which I don't blame Zach. I was playfully roasting him. But it is very hard to like codify this word that we've attached to so many different things now. But the way that I think about it is a digital first organization. And so the key difference between a traditional organization and a DAO is that traditional organizations digitize parts of their organization, but it first passes through the levels and levels of social processes that exist in that organization. And then it reaches sort of a digital endpoint in which something is codified in some piece of software. And with DAOs, the process itself is actually becoming digitized. So all of the social processes and parts of an organization are actually starting to be codified through digitization. And so that I think is like the key way that I define DAOs is through a digital first organization, meaning that the organization itself is entirely digitized rather than relying on digital endpoints.
I really like that definition of it. It definitely brings it to clarity a lot more. Thinking about some of the key principles that determine whether a group of people constitute a DAO or not, whether that's values-based systems, etc. Do any come to mind? Do these principles even exist, and should they? Or do you perceive DAOs as more of a malleable structure?
I definitely see it as more of a malleable structure today, especially. Like, we're still too early, I think, to be maximalist about what groups of people are and are not DAOs. I think we're starting to see people categorize different types of DAOs and different ways in which you can use this framework to further your organization. But I think, again, it really just comes down to this distinction of what tools they use that are pushing them further into organizing digitally rather than relying on some traditional structures that we see.
Can you bring maybe what could be helpful for listeners is to compare like these digital first organizational structures to more maybe Web 2 native structures, like just to really compare the difference between the two?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is, for example, the idea of coming to an agreement or coming to consensus. When we do that in traditional organizations, it flows through your boss and then it follows down to the manager and it goes through all these different people to make that decision. And then once that decision is made, there's a single actor that says, okay, we're firing Fred. And it flows through all of these different communication channels, but it really just relies on social processes. And some of the failures in super large corporations is the level of social processes that exist to reach a decision. And the key difference with DAOs and on-chain organizations is that you can actually start to codify some of those social processes digitally. So, for example, instead of Brian going to Anay and saying like, we're going to make this decision, and then Anay going to talk to Diana about the decision and like this ripple effect of it, we can actually put on an on-chain vote to decide on that and reach a conclusion on that matter in a digital first way, rather than relying on all of these accumulative social processes that build up in traditional organizations.
That's a really great example. And I think that, in traditional organizations, there's a lot of bottlenecks in place and it leads to a lack of efficiency versus when
Yes,
things are on chain, it's a lot more efficient and you can just get more done in a
exactly.
quicker capacity.
I think that brings up a good point too around just generally friction in traditional organizations versus DAOs. And traditional organizations are great at basically accumulating organizational debt. And what I mean by that is overuse of processes and adding more friction than actually required and necessary. And what I think is also really interesting about DAOs is that it's pushing us to think really critically about the friction that exists within our organizations. And basically, when we're saying like we want to digitize some of these processes, that's basically saying we want to reduce friction on this process. And I generally think there's like a lot more thinking and work to be done around that in terms of the tools that we're using and what's actually introducing more friction versus reducing friction. And I think that's like an area of growth with DAOs right now.
One thing that you sort of mentioned and that I think draws a lot of people to DAOs initially is this idea that, DAOs have this lack of hierarchical structure. Some might even think it's a completely flat organizational structure. Do you see that as really being a realistic way of seeing DAOs as, completely flat structures? Or do you think that this is more of just like an over romanticized view or over idealistic view of how DAOs are? And in reality, we actually do need, leadership or some level of hierarchy.
Yeah, I'm very opinionated about this. And I think this idea of like egalitarian, like flat organizations, like one for one is very unrealistic and over romanticized. It's just like not how people naturally work. Again, that was like a big part of my takeaway in coming from this consumer social world is thinking very critically about how people naturally operate rather than trying to like form them in a way that we want them to. And I think that was some of the failures of early DAO implementations or tools is that they sort of had this opinionated idea of how that organization should come to life. and organizations ended up having to meet the needs of that structure rather than structures meeting the needs of that organization. But generally, when I think about power and hierarchy and all of these things, the term that I like to use is localized hierarchies, meaning that there's not a single pyramid structure that exists within the DAO. There's not like one person at the top and then the next level down of C-suite executives and then managers and et cetera, et cetera. There's really like multiple versions of that and throughout the organization. And that's what's most important, is that there is no central point of failure or control in that organization. But I still think we have to think critically about how people naturally operate. Like if we're saying that organizations are these flat structures, that's also assuming a certain archetype of people that we're bringing into DAOs, that they are, self-starters, they direct themselves, they don't need direction, like they're just going to go, go, go. When in reality, that's like not how most people work. And a lot of people rely on direction or feedback or working more critically with a group of peers. And so I don't think it's wrong to start to codify some of these power structures in DAOs and saying, like this group of people or pod has these powers and responsibilities within the DAO. I think that's actually completely fine because you're also being very clear about the path to reaching those power structures, which is where I think the problem exists with basically like hidden power structures in DAOs, is that we're saying DAOs are these flat organizations, but behind the scenes, the core team is moving all these little knobs and has all these access controls. And the token holders, like, they get the idea that they have control, but like in reality, that's really not how things operate. I am very vocal that we need to first just be more realistic about the power structures that already exist in our DAOs and more transparent around it. And two, that we should also just start to codify those things and create instruments around that so that we can actually hold people accountable and ensure that our leaders are actually acting like benevolently on our behalf. And I think the quote that I love, who I think Zach or Trake from Coordinate said, is that DAOs aren't leaderless organizations, they're leaderful organizations, meaning that there are many different people that can be leaders in the organization. I think we have traditionally seen like a single leader in some of our DAOs, like, for example, Kane being the semi-benevolent dictator of synthetics. But I think our future DAOs will start to see a wave of layers of leaders in an organization that lead these sort of different localized hierarchies.
Power, I think, is such like an ambiguous term in the sense that power, I think, elicits maybe a multitude of feelings in people who are listening. Some people might have had bad experiences with people in power and associate that as Hitler had a lot of power. Other people might, have had positive experiences with benevolent leaders in their companies or organizations and have a very positive view of, leadership and power. When you talk about power within DAOs and maybe within pods specifically, how would you categorize the types of power that people might have? And I would also love to know how you think this compares to the different types of power that people have in traditional Web 2 companies, where we see there's a CEO at the top, there's a C-suite people, there's managers, there's the associates or the junior members at the bottom. That's what we're familiar with. How would you compare or contrast that to the power structures that you see exist within DAOs?
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot there. First, when I think about the types of power that exist in a DAO, I very much break it down into the sort of hard/discrete powers versus the social powers. So, for example, we're using Kane as a semi-benevolent dictator. Kane stepped down from synthetics and said, like, I'm giving up the reins. I'm not participating in the DAO anymore. But what actually happened was that he realized he still held so much social power in the DAO and that he really was seen as like this figure and leader within the DAO. And that even though he was breaking off from some of these hard powers, he still had this immense social power. And I think we see that a lot through Twitter followings, through Discord presence, through money, status, reputation, all of those things. But when it comes to hard powers and like these discrete powers in a DAO, I sort of break it down into three categories. And I guess to just back up, when I say discrete powers, like what can actually be codified on chain in the distribution of power throughout a DAO. And that exists in three categories, which are spending power. So just the flow of assets in an organization. I get to pay out these contributors where money goes, basically. The second one is governance power. So actually holding on to either delegated voting rights or your bags equate to some kind of governance voting power. And that's more of the referendum style voting power. The third category of discrete powers is basically like contract powers. So actually being able to delegate, contract keys to someone or access/permissions to certain code bases, or however you can actually delegate the contractual elements of a protocol or permissions throughout the organization on chain. And so when we think about these types of like discrete and social powers, I think it's really important that like we can start to codify the discrete powers on chain. Whereas in a traditional organization, a lot of that is very unclear in terms of what powers exist where. And most of it is pushed to the top. Let's say I work for a big consulting firm and I have a corporate credit card. I rack up expenses on this trip, like et cetera, et cetera. I don't actually just get free money from this corporate card. There is a chain of command at which my expenses flow up to. And, the manager looks at it and approves it. Then his manager has to look at it and approve it. Then the CEO looks at it and approves it. And there's basically this whole chain of command, but it's still very unclear, like how those power dynamics are laid out in that organization. Whereas we have the opportunity to be like crystal clear about that in DAOs. Again, I don't think we're there yet, but that's like something that we're working on very critically at Orca is how do we actually distribute and delegate power within an organization.
I think another difference I think about when I think about like power in Web2 companies versus power in DAOs is that the power dynamic in DAOs, I think, is a lot more malleable than the power dynamic in traditional companies, where traditional companies, in order to get a promotion, to level up, become a manager, become C-suite, there's so many steps. And, depending on the company, it could be like you have to be there for X number of years. You have to like meet your KPIs. You have to do all of these things and it takes time. Whereas in DAOs, I think that can shift a lot more quickly, whether it's people who start out as just contributors to the DAO who quickly become leaders of a pod, for instance, or if it's people who started out as core contributors or leaders to the pods and decide that, okay, like I've set this up, this is running really well, now I can take a step back and not have that level of responsibility anymore. Do you agree with that?
100%. And I think also, like what I'm hearing you say is that the path to power is a lot clearer in DAOs. Like, if you're just an adjacent like contributor at a DAO and you want to be like a core contributor or you want to be like on the meta governance pod, there's a very clear path of like how you get there versus in a traditional organization, like you're basically at the discretion of whoever's above you.
Yeah, 100%. I think like my last question on this point, and this is something that I've actually had a hard time with, is thinking through how much autonomy do we give our contributors versus guidance? And so I think what we've heard from our contributors is, everybody wants some level of autonomy. I don't think anybody likes being micromanaged. But at the same time, like you said, like most people out there aren't the self-starter entrepreneurial type of people who can just take something and run with it. So people do like to have some sort of guidance. And I think finding that balance has been a big challenge for me personally. So I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts on like how to best find that balance.
Yeah, I will say that Chase Chapman is doing a lot of amazing work here within our community. This is definitely like a tension we've seen between Sonar Labs, which is a Delaware C Corp and pays out some of the core contributors working on Orca Protocol. And then we have Orcanauts, which is our community ecosystem. And there's definitely a big tension there in terms of what's under the discretion of Sonar Labs versus under the discretion of Orcanauts, and some of the power dynamics there, some of the transparency there. There's a lot of variables to navigate and basically completely rework. I will say Chase has done truly amazing work around it. And I think one of the biggest things is again, just being very, very explicit about where power sits. And some of the work that she's doing is basically identifying the sort of aims and domains of different pods within our ecosystem. So it's very easy to say, like, okay, here's the meta governance pod. Like, they work on meta governance. But like, let's be more explicit about that. Like, why are they working towards that? What is their North Star? What is actually within their purview to work on? Like, does that mean that they are doing business development? Does that mean that they are just voting on things? Like, let's be very, very clear about what's really within their purview. I think that is very much the way we think about it, is working with the community to all agree on the aims and domains that they're excited about and like what they all want to work on. And that gives them the autonomy to work within those aims and domains and push forward on that. So if there's a very clear agenda that the meta governance pod is strictly voting on proposals of DAOs that they have voting power in, perfect. Like, now that I'm in the meta governance pod, I have a very clear idea that like I can go work with Compound and, you know, help them build out this proposal or vote on this proposal. It's much easier for me to understand like where I have autonomy and also a sense of guidance.
Yeah, I think that's super impactful. Going back to an earlier point you said, really how I think Orca is doing a lot of incredible work, specifically in thinking about how to distribute and delegate power within an organization. And key to that is governance power within a DAO. I'm curious how you think about who should have governance rights over a DAO, and also how many people there should be within this framework.
Yeah, I think in answering this question, like, we first have to acknowledge the governance rights that exist today, which is basically just token weighted voting. Like, that's really the only governance right that is widely adopted in the DAO ecosystem today, which is super frustrating because we've seen a number of problems with that type of structure. For example, it's very much mimicking like plutocracy, as in the wealthiest individuals have the most power in an ecosystem. Voter apathy, people aren't excited to vote. People don't feel like they have right to participate. It's too expensive. Like, there are all these things that come up with token weighted voting. I very much think of Vitalik's framework of autocracy like veto-ocracy versus bulldozer governance, which is basically like two styles of governance, consensus, coordination. Veto-ocracy is very much like stakeholder governance. So that's what we see in all DAOs today with token weighted voting. Bulldozer governance is much more, you know, we're giving a small group of people or individuals a high amount of autonomy and power to do what they think is best. That doesn't really exist in DAOs right now, at least explicitly. Like I said, there are a lot of hidden ways that exists, but we're not being transparent and saying like, this group of people has full autonomy to run our meta governance program. And so I think it's really important that we start introducing those types of frameworks. And that's what we're working on with Orca, with the use of pods, is actually being able to delegate power to groups of people. And that gives like a very clear governance right, is that you have the governing ability to operate within this domain that has been set. And I don't think it's like one or the other. I think there very much needs to be like a combination and mixture layering element of the two. But to rely on one specifically, I think, is a failure. And the state of DAOs today is that we are only relying on a single coordination and consensus mechanism. And that I see as a real failure. So we're very excited to work on that with Orca and basically creating new coordination and consensus mechanisms.
So related to that point of autonomy, I think that's super interesting. But then how do you determine what people have the autonomy over certain decisions, for example?
Yeah, it's like, how do you coordinate who gets to do the coordinating with our current coordination systems? It's not really an easy path forward. I mean, I think when we think about onboarding with pods, you do have to go through your traditional governance structures today. So, for example, we just onboarded ENS. They went through full token weighted voting, token holder governing around these working groups that they were spinning up. First, they decided on spinning up the working groups and the need for this. Then they decided on who got to sit on these working groups and who actually got to participate in these decisions. Then the token holders got to vote on how much money they were allocated and the actual distribution of power. Like there are all these layers that went through to actually ratifying that type of bulldozer governance per se. But it's definitely really tricky. Like working within the bounds of our failed coordination systems to build out new coordination systems is definitely a challenge. But I think that the sooner we start to introduce pods and this type of bulldozer governance, the more we're able to iterate and expand very quickly. But the key thing with pods is that we're creating this governance wrapper so that it's not just like this floating pod that can do whatever they want after they've spun up. Like you're actually able to attach it into the governance system that exists within the organization. So, if you want to delegate the rights for the token holders to vote who sits on the pods, that's something that you can do. And making it very, very explicit how there's sort of checks and balances within this organization. And I think that's probably one of the biggest missing pieces today is that we don't really have these accountability systems to actually start to delegate power away from token holders.
I feel like that's super critical for sure. Speaking about another challenge within DAO governance.
There's only a few, right?
Yeah, only a few. But something that I think about a lot is as DAOs expand, right? And as you're funneling more contributors into the ecosystem, and I talk about this with Chase a lot, right? It's like there's two big problems in DAOs, understanding the culture of context and the culture of contribution, among other problems that we have. But as a DAO's governance structure, but how do you think about how a DAO's governance structure shifts as a DAO gets bigger?
It's a tough one. I very much think of it as like, I think Chase memed this of DAO bar's number, or maybe it was even Brian. But again, this was like some of my very early thinking with the consumer social stuff is that I was thinking very critically about Dunbar's number. And basically what's happened in Web 2 is like to introduce Dunbar's number is basically the cognitive limit we have on our social relationships. So you have like these concentric circles of closeness. So like obviously your family and like your closest friends sit in like this small little bubble around you. The next layer would be like maybe your older friends who you're not as close with, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, the max number is like 150 people that we can basically maintain a relationship with. And what has happened in Web 2 is like we now have this massive bubble around us of thousands and thousands of people that we are supposed to have relationships with via social networks, like online, all of these things. And the same thing is happening with DAOs is like we have this massive, massive, massive pool of people that sit without real like infrastructure to start to codify and carve out these atomic units of intimacy or work or communication that exist within the DAO. And so when we think about DAOs getting bigger, we need to be very critical about introducing the infrastructure to ensure they scale correctly so that we're not just pumping more people into this outer bubble of like thousands and thousands of contributors that like don't really know each other, that like see each other's Discord name, that maybe see each other vote, but like have no real connection. I think Zach or Drake also said this, but this is really just a Zach, Drake, and Chase Stan podcast.
We love it. We're also big stans.
Is that organizations can only scale at the speed of trust, I think was the quote. And basically that you need to ensure that trust is scaling just as the organization is scaling. And so I see a lot of that is group formation and ensuring that there are those closer knit ecosystems within this larger mega ecosystem. So yeah, I think it really comes back down to like the DAO bar's number meme.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also like we've been talking about throughout this conversation, codifying different structures and processes within the DAO so people know what they're doing and where they're moving towards is a critical element to building trust as well.
Yes, 100%. This is something we're thinking a lot about at Orca right now is basically how do you scale trust? And I'll give a little alpha on something we're working on, which is, ooh la la, which is basically the idea of trustware and socialware. And the idea there is socialware is like the sum of processes that exist in our organization. So all of us communicating, our trusted relationships, us having to go through different processes within our organization. That's all socialware. Those is like the social relations and social mechanisms that exist in our organization. It requires a large social cost to maintain all of those things, though. So all of us maintaining our trusted relationships, that requires a lot of work to ensure that scales. Whereas with trustware is basically the introduction of digitizing the trust centers within an organization. And so obviously we see that as being on chain and using this like trust layer that exists on like Ethereum, the blockchain, to scale the trust centers within our organization. And so I very much think of it as like you have these core trust centers that exist in your organizations and layers of socialware around all of those trust centers.
This is like one of those podcasts where I'm like, holy shit, okay, I need to go and like re-listen to this as soon as we're done because I just don't have the capacity to digest and continue the conversation at the same time.
I basically just threw like a mind dump on you, so please process away.
Yeah, no, I will process it, I think, in the solitude of my own home after this is over, so we don't drag everyone down with me. But I did want to ask you, Julia, like looking ahead to the future, where do you see the DAO landscape being in, let's say, a few years? And along with that, like, what do you see as some of the main things that need to change in DAOs as it exists today in order to have like a successful, however you define that, DAO ecosystem down the line?
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. But I think what I see for the DAO landscape in the next few years is a huge like siphon away from traditional organizations. Is that once we unlock the sort of digitization element, we will start to see DAOs actually become more efficient than traditional organizations, which I know sounds crazy to say right now because DAOs are an absolute shit show. But that is like genuinely where I think DAOs are headed. There's all these social processes that just introduce more and more friction in traditional organizations that we see today. Whereas we're really able to like squash a lot of that in DAOs because of this introduction of trustware or digitization. And I think like we need to think very critically about the tools and infrastructure we're putting in place right now. Because if we repeat basically the processes we see in traditional organizations and DAOs are very short-sighted, we will just continue to latch on to this traditional structure, both in like the social processes, the digital processes, all of that. And I see that as a huge, I guess, opportunity for failure, which we're very much working against with Orca and actually introducing pods as like a key element of the digitization of organizations.
Yeah, and just because not to be a downer, but just because I also like to present sort of like the other side of the argument, so we're not all getting disillusioned that like DAOs are the future, Web3 fixes this, DAO fixes this. Like there are definitely like roadblocks and things we need to watch out for. So if DAOs completely cease to exist in 5 years, why do you think that would be?
I think it's like what I was just saying in that if we are just repeating what we're already seeing in traditional organizations, they will cease to exist because there's no need to create a DAO if you can just create a company. And if we're using all of the company processes and structures and tech, then what are we even doing here? Like there's no need for the DAO to exist. And so I think it's really, really important that we're thinking critically about the tools that we're using. That's basically what an organization comes down to at the end of the day is the social processes and digital endpoints or digitization and like ratification of these elements of an organization. So if we're basically just repeating what we see in traditional organizations, like, let's get a QuickBooks going and like, let's just do the things that we've seen. Like we're inherently just taking the shape of traditional organizations. And so we need to think very, very critically about the tools that we're introducing.
Yeah, I think so too. I think alongside that too, like one point to maybe bring up is like just because you can do something doesn't mean you should necessarily do it. I think that's also another mistake I see people making is like people get so excited about all this DAO tooling and all these like new technologies they can use. And they're like, let's use all of them because it's like in line with Web3. So how can it possibly hurt us? And it's like, no, like you should, just because it's there, it doesn't mean you should use it. You should still think critically about like how to improve your organization.
100%. And I think it goes back to one of my earlier points around friction in an organization is that people are adopting all these tools and things because they think that it's going to accelerate their organization, but they're actually introducing more friction than reducing friction by introducing these tools. Even, for example, like token-weighted voting, like introducing the governor contract. Literally every single DAO implements that because it's what we've seen, it's what's been done. We know, it works technically. Like that's what every DAO uses, so we should use it too. But there's actually a massive amount of friction that exists there, both like organizational friction and like getting people to vote and like the downfalls of stakeholder governance. There's also the technical friction that exists, and then Snapshot comes along and is like off-chain voting, we're removing that frictional element of it. But there's still the organizational frictional element of it. And even if you're introducing Snapshot, you have to think very critically about the friction that you're introducing by implementing that tool and that process. So yes, I completely agree with you that people are very quick to just like adopt all these Web3 tools and like, woo, we love DAO tools. But what is actually required of your organization? Like I sort of think of the term, which everyone loves to meme now, is like your minimum viable organization. Like what is absolutely required for your organization to function? And you need to introduce different tools and different experiments very carefully to ensure that you're not introducing more friction rather than relieving and alleviating friction.
Yeah, 100%. And it always like comes back to me. I had this professor in law school that always said, KISS as like the principle, keep it simple, stupid. It's such like an old man, like boomer thing to say, but it's like, it's also so true. Like so many times if people would just take that advice, keep it simple. Like you could get so much farther.
Wait, what's the extra
with
S?
Like, keep it simple, stupid, because you got to throw that in there too.
We need our DAOs to kiss.
That's a tweet. I'm sending that out right now. We need our DAOs to kiss.
Amazing.
No one will understand what I'm saying.
True. This boomer professor knew what he was talking about.
Boomers know things sometimes.
They do.
Occasionally.
We can hear things and interpret it differently and use the KISS element differently than this white boomer man, but the idea is there.
We should all do more kissing. That's the takeaway from this podcast. Kiss more. All right. Okay. We're going off the rails a little bit. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to come on this podcast. All right, Julia, last thing before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you personally, get more of your thoughts, and where people can go to learn more about Orca.
Yes. If you want to hear my thoughts, you can find me on Twitter at Jules Rose with Z's. And Orca Protocol on Twitter. Come through to our Discord. Potentially can become an Orcanaut and contribute to cool stuff we have going and participate in some of the first pods out in the wild. But thank you guys so much for having me.
All right, everybody, go follow Julia at Jules Rose. Go follow Orca. Go become an Orcanaut. And we will see you again. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to get involved in helping shape next season of the podcast, including nominating and voting on your favorite guests, go to rehash.mirror.xyz to join our crowdfund. And don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe to help us get this podcast heard by as many people as possible. Thanks for being part of this community, and I can't wait to connect with many of you in Discord and Twitter soon.